So what we're going to do here is look at the last part 8 of Max Tegmark's Life 3.0, where his focus is on consciousness. And he starts with a definition of consciousness. And he tells us that consciousness equals subjective experience. So the whole focus is on the subject. And he says that rather than looking at it as a problem to solve as to how we can prove consciousness, he wants to look at it as a fact to either prove or disprove that consciousness exists. So again, the focus here will be on the fact of consciousness. And the way he goes about this is he looks at this problem as basically having an easy, pretty hard, even harder, and really hard pieces. And he says that as far as the easy piece goes, he said we're not really going to deal with that piece, that's actually dealt with in other disciplines and by other people and dealt with well. So his focus is on physical properties. Again, he's a physicist, all right? So what physical properties distinguish conscious and unconscious systems? And he talks about theories that were testable with brain reading, and he goes through those. But the basic net of it is that he says, that basically consciousness feels non-physical. And he believes that it feels non-physical because it actually is an emergent property. And he talks about it that one of the things about emergent properties is that they almost feel magical, like the idea of wetness, which comes from the combination of hydrogen and oxygen. It feels like it's something that just emerged, and it's almost like magic. But yet emerged properties actually can be measured. And he talks about how we want to measure and he wants to talk about measuring the information. So he says the information storage capacity. So we can look at the storage capacity from dynamics principle. He says we can look at the information processing capacity, how it can process things. From the independence principle, he says that it has to be independent from the rest of the world, all right? That otherwise we couldn't measure it because it would be so integrated. And the last one is the integration itself, all right? And so it can't be just a bunch of independent parts. It can't be a federation of independent parts. It has to actually be something that is integrated. And he uses a theory called the integrated information theory in order to kind of outline how that can be measured. The other thing he says is, what physical properties, the components of subjective experience, which are a bunch of individual qualia, right? So basically, subjective experience is a kind of a bundling of a bunch of individual qualia. And right now, this is where I'm going to have to go out on a limb here because I don't understand exactly where he goes with this, and I'm going to have to take what I think he's saying. But anyway, from an object basis, if we look at any object out in the world, it has behaviors and attributes. Behaviors are the processes that the object does. The attributes are basically things like the color or the status or the state of the object. And these things are what in philosophy they would call what is the being of that. And the idea here is that being actually affects the processes themselves. So if we take an example of a picture, the picture of this grandfather with his granddaughter and the dog, that the subject itself of the grandfather is actually different because he's a grandfather. It affects the relationship that he's having. It affects this whole, if he was just sitting there with any other young girl and a dog, it would be different. So his being a grandfather affects this. Now, for Max, I mean, because he's a physicist, he wants to advantage things are doing and processes. And what we've done here is I've kind of, in terms of this idea of being out on the limb, I've kind of turned his question upside down. And what I've said basically is that what I think he's saying in different words is how do qualia affect the processes themselves, right? So how does being a certain color bird affect the processes, or being the grandfather affect things? Then he goes on to talk about how this qualia, we have the issue of surrounding this qualia of being humans. And part of the issue is that it's a very narrow spectrum for us for qualia, right? I mean, it's limited by our 5 senses, by our brain, by other things like that. So what we can see and what we can do is rather limited. Whereas artificial intelligence, it's a much much span for the artificial intelligence can see, and it's much deeper. And not only that, but not only wider and deeper, but it even has more dimensions. So it's multidimensional, it's wider, it's deeper. So artificial intelligence is looking at a different world than us. And then he goes into talk about why is anything at all conscious. And this is where he started out early on about the fact of added complexity, that added complexity to the universe. Things like gravity brought added complexity to the universe. And so then what we see, though, is that it's pretty easy to see that natural selection itself actually advantaged this concept of added or of dealing with added complexity. So it advantaged consciousness. So the ability to deal with that added complexity was something that that consciousness was able to advantage. It's the number of talents that we had. However, over time, our cultural focus has actually been as we've driven down the number of talents that an individual needs, and so we've emphasized specialization. And specialization actually advantages intelligence. So intelligence is kind of advantage here on specialization. And then the question becomes, actually, can we separate or can we decouple consciousness and intelligence, and can they exist by themselves? However, we already pointed out the fact that artificial intelligence really is a much more complicated issue. And so if we're looking at this measuring of complexity and integration, when you look at the fact that in any complex system, that 93% of the challenges occur at the integration points, you're looking at the fact that, that really what we see is that the winner is going to be artificial intelligence plus consciousness. And the advantage there, on top of everything else, is it also allows us to add meaning because of the consciousness to our visiting and our meaning to the universe itself. And that's kind of where Max ends in terms of part 8. Thank you.